Jewish or not. For more information, I invite you to visit our website, jewishforgood.org, to look up some upcoming programs we have planned, like Shmuzanash, our Care Partner Support Group, and Memory Cafe. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker today. This is Christina Hall. She is a Senior and Specialty Move Manager and the founder and owner-operator of Transitions Made Simple. Her talk today is called Effective Downsizing and Home Adjustments. Christina Hall is the founder and owner-operator of Transitions Made Simple. In her role as a Senior and Specialty Move Manager, she is dedicated to guiding clients and their families seamlessly into their next chapter of life. Holding a degree in healthcare administration and boasting over a decade of professional experience, Christina brings a unique blend of expertise to the senior move management industry. Before establishing Transitions Made Simple, she held various roles at UNC Health, Life Plan Communities, and skilled nursing facilities. These roles fueled her passion for working with older adults and provided her with the necessary skills to manage complex life transitions with professionalism and compassion. In addition to her hands-on experience, Christina is a certified associate in project management and has undergone formal training specific to the move management industry. This training ensures that every move she oversees is not merely a change of address, but a carefully orchestrated transition. So we are so lucky to have you here with us, Christina. I will toss it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I am so excited to be here this morning. Thank you all for choosing to spend your morning with me. I promise to do my best to educate all of you to the best of my ability. And I put a lot of care and thought into the presentation that I created today. So let me go ahead. I'm going to share my screen and let me do that right now. Give me one moment. Okay. So you can see that, right? Okay. So today's discussion, I am going to be talking about navigating the different transitions that life brings, and I will be providing some practical tips on how to effectively downsize. I'm sure a lot of people here are maybe thinking about going through the downsizing process. Maybe you're helping to support someone who's thinking about or going through downsizing. And so I kept that audience in mind when I put this together. So I tried to make it applicable to either of those scenarios. All right. So let me first start out by introducing myself. Again, I'm Christina Hall, and I am I'm very passionate about what I do, and I'm so excited to be here. I'm huge on advocating for supporting older adults through major life changes. And I am the owner operator of Transitions Made Simple. And we are a senior and specialty move management company that serves the Triangle area of North Carolina. So our main goal is to reduce the stress that comes with the process of downsizing and moving. And I also want to make a note. So there's a lot of information on these slides, and I know it was mentioned that I'll share a summary. Don't feel like you need to write all of this down, and don't feel like you need to necessarily read through the slides. I just want to make a note of that because there's a lot of words on the slides. So I'll consolidate that all into an easier format for you all to follow. So let's dive right in. I want to take a moment to talk about my objectives for today. Like I said, my goal today is to educate everyone here. I want you to feel empowered, and I want you to feel educated when you walk away today. And I'm going to touch on the different types of transitions that I oftentimes see, so you can better understand the complexities that go into downsizing and relocating. And I'll also talk about the emotional, logistical, and physical challenges that are so often faced. I will be diving into some practical strategies that you can actually implement yourselves. And I'll be sharing some actionable tips and some methods that you can use to help simplify the process. I'll be talking about how to manage and overcome some common obstacles that I see a lot. And my goal is to equip you with some tools and some resources so you can take this on. All right. So I want to provide a little bit of an overview so you know what to expect. Let me move this. So today, our key points that we will be talking about, I'll be, like I said, going over some of the different types of transitions that I commonly see, and I'll be discussing something called relocation stress. I missed that. Was that a question?
I think that was somebody just signing on, unmuted.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. So let me start, I'll restart on this slide. So today, I just want to provide a quick overview of what I will be discussing. We'll go over some of the different types of transitions and what that looks like. We will be touching on something that is very important to me to talk about, which is relocation stress syndrome. I will be going over some of the key challenges that I see often in the transition process. I'll talk about some common mistakes that are made. I'll go over the emotional aspects of downsizing because obviously that is a huge piece of this. And I'll be providing some practical strategies that you can use, as well as some tools and some resources to think about. And I'll be touching on the role of professional services and what's available to you for help. And then we will wrap up the session at the end with a Q&A. So let's get started. The first section of today's presentation, I am going to talk about different transition types because they can look a lot different for different people. And I want to take some time to emphasize what's at stake. So first off, like I said, there are many different types of transitions, and it's not limited to what's included on this list, but sometimes it could look like relocating to a smaller house or downsizing. Maybe you or someone you love is moving to a senior living community. Maybe you're thinking about adapting your current home to better suit your needs. Maybe you want to age in place in your home and make some changes there, which always has a little bit of a downsizing component to it, which a lot of people don't think about. Maybe you're moving closer to family, or you're adjusting to retirement. And maybe it's that you lost a spouse or someone you love, and maybe you've received an unexpected medical diagnosis. So these can look very different for everyone, and sometimes they can happen very suddenly. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I want to take some time to talk about relocation stress syndrome, which I love talking about this because so many people don't know about relocation stress syndrome. And it's actually at the core of what I do. I find it very important to educate people on what exactly is at stake and provide some prevention strategies to help mitigate the effects of this. So if you've never heard of relocation stress syndrome, it's also called transfer trauma. And it's a condition that's often experienced by seniors when moving to a new environment. And it's characterized by anxiety, confusion, and loneliness. So it has some very major consequences. Relocation stress syndrome can cause physical and emotional distress, and that can exacerbate existing health issues, which can lead to an increased risk of falls or maybe a rapid decline in health. So it's a really serious topic, and I make it my mission to educate as many people as I can on this, because many people don't know that this is what's at stake. So on my next slide, this slide, I am going to go over some prevention strategies for relocation stress syndrome. Because the good news is, if you're prepared for this, you're able to help minimize the effects of it. And so I will start off by saying that early planning is absolute key. So you should begin as far in advance as possible with planning if you're able to, so you can avoid that rush and the panic of consolidating all of this into one short period of time, which can be very, very emotional and it can be traumatic. It's also really important for prevention that the senior involved has heavy involvement in decision making, and it's important that they feel in control. And I know that that looks different for everybody, but oftentimes when decisions are made for seniors without their input, they can feel very much out of control. And so it's so important to explain what's happening, try to work as a team whenever possible with the person who's maybe moving. We'll use that as an example. Make sure they're aware of everything that's happening, everything that's coming up, because I think for anyone, it can be really traumatic to go through a process if you don't know what to expect. So that's a huge piece of this. And I remind families all the time that that is a major thing that I advocate for throughout the relocation process in specific. It's also important, whenever possible, to maintain a familiar routine. And I know sometimes that's easier said than done, but it's just worth thinking about. And tying into that point, whenever you're able to preserve a familiar environment, incorporate familiar items or furniture and set that up in a way that feels familiar, that's a huge key to this too. And that's something that we often advocate for with our clients and their families, because when you move to an entirely new setting, if you've been used to your furniture being set up a certain way for maybe decades, then this will help you ease into that change a little bit. So I am going to now talk a little bit about some key challenges that I often see and some common mistakes that are made along the way. I feel like I am giving a lot of information, so I'll try to talk a little slower so you can really absorb the information as we go through this. But like I said, don't feel like you need to write all of this down. I will share a summary with you all, which will have all of these key points on it. Could you just make sure you are muted? Take a moment to make sure you're muted. I think there's maybe one or two people that are not. Thank you. Okay, so I am going to move into some challenges that often come up in the transition process. I split this up into 3 different categories. So I'm going to first touch on the emotional challenges, and then I'll talk a little bit about some physical challenges that are often faced. And then we'll move into more of the logistical challenges that also come along with this process. So for the first point, obviously, there are many emotional challenges that come up, especially in the downsizing process. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but a lot of times you feel very sentimental toward items and that your belongings that you've had for decades oftentimes, and you're very likely struggling with the thought of parting from your possessions, because you might feel like you're actually losing the memories that are associated with those items. And so I will talk a little bit later on about how to handle that. But that is a challenge that is very often faced in this process. And then another emotional challenge that people usually deal with is feeling like you're losing a part of your identity because you have such an extreme change in lifestyle and you're trying to adjust to a new living situation. So a lot of times maybe you've lived in your neighborhood for decades. Maybe you've been in your home for 50, 60 years, and you're very familiar with your community and your neighbors and everything that's in your home. So the thought of changing that familiar, environment is scary and it's emotional. And rightfully so. I think that's scary for anybody. So I think recognizing that is a big key. So then we've got, on top of the emotional struggles, we've got the physical challenges that come along with this process as well. So a lot of times there are limitations with mobility and endurance, and the effort and strain of moving and making decisions, and the sheer amount of physical and mental work that's involved in that process is completely overwhelming. And then on top of these two challenges, you've also got, hold on, I'm going to move into logistical challenges next. Okay, so this is not everything logistically that can be challenging, obviously, but it's some of the key pieces that I see a lot of the times. So obviously, the logistics that go into sorting and organizing your entire home, that is such an incredibly daunting task. And trying to decide what to take with you to your new home, or especially if you're downsizing and moving to a much smaller space, trying to figure out what to donate, what to sell, maybe what to throw away. And if you've got items that you would like to disperse to family or disperse to friends, that's another decision. And there are logistics that go into making that happen, right? And then you've got the complexities of the actual transaction of selling or maybe buying your home. So the home sale process comes with a lot of coordination and things to think about, and trying to figure out what vendors to work with and coordinating those vendors. It's a lot at one time. And that can lead into information overload. So you feel like you've just taken in way too much at once, and maybe you're feeling a little bit of decision fatigue, where you're just completely exhausted from making so many decisions in a short period of time. So these are just some examples of challenges that often come up, obviously not limited to those that I just mentioned. So I will now talk about common mistakes that I see a lot in the downsizing process that are made. And then I'll discuss how we can overcome these mistakes later on in the presentation. So rightfully, as humans, we have a tendency to procrastinate, especially with something as daunting as downsizing. And I first want to validate the feelings that you have around that. I think it's completely natural to feel like you want to procrastinate this process, especially if you have been in your home for many decades and you've accumulated a lot of stuff. You feel like there's a lot of decisions to be made, right? So that's a major mistake, rightfully so, that many people make. And then tying into that, especially if there's a sudden change in your life that has prompted downsizing, you might be trying to tackle everything at one time. And that can lead to an extreme sense of overwhelm, which then it's not only traumatic for you, but it's also not as effective of a process as it could be if there was some planning involved beforehand. So then we've got the emotional decision-making piece, where you are allowing your emotions to overwhelmingly guide your decisions on what you're going to be bringing, especially if you're downsizing, to your new home. And I see this happen a lot, where you tell yourself, I'll just try and make it work. and there's no pre-planning. This is especially applicable to large furniture pieces. And then you end up taking too much, and that's an emotional burden on the other end by itself. So I've got some more mistakes that I'm going to talk about that I see a lot of the times. And I'm trying to keep this paced so it's not too much information at once, but we can talk at the end. If you feel like I skimmed over something a little bit too quickly, we can regroup at the end and I can elaborate on anything that might have been rushed through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the emotional impact that comes with downsizing and how this is a piece that I a lot of times see failure to anticipate truly how much this will affect you, emotionally, mentally. This is a huge process. And I think because we put it off for so long, when it does happen, you don't take the time to really realize how difficult that's going to be for you. And maybe you're trying to keep that to yourself. You're not trying to show the people in your life how truly overwhelmed you are. And so I think a huge key to that is knowing that you do not have to deal with that stress alone. And there are a lot of people that feel very similar toward, especially the downsizing process. So that's a huge piece. I felt like that was a very important point to make. And I'll again dive in later on how we can work through that. Another mistake that I see all the time is ineffective sorting. And truly, this is something I see very, very often. Sorting when you're downsizing is a major key piece of the process. And if you're not effectively sorting things and placing them where they should go, so maybe you've decided in one room I'm going to put items that I want to keep, in this room I'll put donations, whatever your system might be. If you don't have an adequate sorting technique, it can cause you so much more confusion than, in which that's our goal, is to minimize confusion, right? And make this as effective as possible. So that could also lead to misplaced items, just general confusion overall with the process. And I've got a big tip for you here. I always tell people to try and handle each item in your home, whenever possible, only one time. And I know that that's easier said than done, but if you're working through a space and you pick something up and you put it in a maybe pile, that's going to cause you a lot more stress than if you just made a decision at that time. So obviously I know there will be maybe piles, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But that is my advice, is to just handle something once if you're able to. That way you're not moving it around your house multiple times, which takes a lot of time. So I also see decision fatigue because people are trying to make too many decisions at one time, which obviously leads to you feeling completely exhausted, not only in that moment, but exhausted with the whole process. So to help with this, I recommend breaking the work into sessions. And when you feel like you are at a stopping point and you're just completely overwhelmed, then stop the process right there and come back to it. I think a lot of times we'll try to push through even when we're tired, and that is not effective, because the decisions that you make when you're feeling that way might not align with the decisions that you truly want to make. So something worth thinking about. And kind of what I talked about earlier, where you maybe have reluctance asking for help naturally, because you might be trying to handle this downsizing process yourself. And that really can magnify the stress that you are feeling when you feel like you can't reach out to someone, and at the very least, talk through it with them. So I highly, highly recommend seeking help from family, seeking help from friends, or maybe professionals if you truly feel like you cannot handle it yourself. And a lot of times, people know someone who has gone through this process. Maybe they're going through it themselves. And that will be incredibly helpful for you to be able to work through those emotions that you're feeling, just by asking for some help from others. So, all of that said, I think the biggest key to success in this process is starting as early as possible, because that will allow you to feel like you've got ample time to make thoughtful decisions. And I want you to take this as your sign to begin in some way, however that looks for you. I know it might be different for each person, but use today's presentation as a sign to start. Maybe that's just planning. I think that will really help you in the event that maybe later on you've got a sudden change in your life that leads to the need to downsize or some other type of transition. Okay, so now we'll really get into the bulk of today's talk. And I reiterate, there will be a lot of information included in our next session or section, which is practical strategies for effective downsizing. I'm going to be sharing a lot of different tips here, some different advice and tricks that you can use. So there will be a lot of info here. So I don't want you to feel overwhelmed, okay? I also wanted it to be very impactful though. So I tried to squeeze a lot in here. And I did break this down a little bit into the different pieces of the process. So my first tips have to do with planning and starting the process. And I just feel like that might be a little bit easier to take in. So like I said, I'll start by talking about the planning and starting point of the process. My advice here is to set clear goals and write those down. I think that is a huge key. And I also, maybe to go a step further, recommend that you share your goals with someone else. And maybe you schedule meetings or calls or visits with that person to hold yourself accountable. So I think it's human nature. Again, we all procrastinate to some degree. And I think with something as daunting as downsizing, we don't want to think about it and we don't want to start. So first step is to just, set goals with yourself, write those out. And then next, make a timeline that aligns with those goals. So that's where you can tie your goals in and actually give yourself maybe some deadlines for each stage of the process. I find that is really key, and that's what keeps everything on track. So obviously a key part to the timeline though is sticking to it. So that's where bringing someone else in to hold you accountable might be really helpful. And that'll help you, you'll maintain momentum, you'll be able to focus. I think so often starting is the hardest part, and it's not fun to think about starting, but you'll find that once you do begin, it's a lot easier to just keep going if you've given yourself some manageable goals to work through. And I think it's a good opportunity. There's no saying that you cannot make this process fun, right? So maybe use this as an opportunity to invite friends over and invite family over to help sort through items. And I think it's a great time to reminisce and talk about memories. And so often your family or your friends don't actually know the story behind things that are really important to you. Or maybe you want to reminisce on a trip that you took with friends. That's a really good opportunity to do so. maybe go through pictures of that trip with them and talk through it. So I do think it is a great opportunity. Don't make this a really serious process. If you're able to, make it fun and bring some people in that can help you through it. Our next tips, I'm going to talk about the actual sorting piece and how to decide on what to do with things. So, biggest piece tying into just start. When you do start, try and focus on the areas that have the least amount of sentimental items to you. So I typically recommend starting in maybe a storage space or the garage, something similar, where it's not items that are stirring up a lot of emotions for you to get rid of. And I also recommend that you use a system where you work through one room at a time and try and finish a room before you go into another space of your house. I think that's key, because feeling like you're actually making progress will help you a lot. Going back to, I touched on this a little bit earlier, have a direct sorting method to keep yourself organized throughout the process. So set clear, maybe you set clear areas for the items that you want to keep, the items that you want to donate, those that you want to sell or you're thinking about selling, and then, trash and the items that you want to disperse. That will really help you. That way you don't look at an area where there's all sorts of things, strewn about. That's going to cause you stress. So direct sorting method, and make immediate decisions whenever possible to prevent clutter. Tying back to the avoiding maybe piles, if you do have items that you cannot make a decision on, then I recommend setting a deadline to revisit the decision, because that will help you actually stay accountable to come back and decide what you want to do with something. So strongly advise to do that. And another piece of advice for you, I personally do not recommend long-term storage space rentals, because oftentimes those are just used to avoid making decisions. Not always, obviously. But if that's something that you're able to cut out of the process, then maybe consider doing that. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how you can creatively approach things and how to manage emotions that arise when you're trying to work through downsizing. I think this is a fun slide, because a lot of people don't think, again, it doesn't have to be a really serious process. You can make this fun. And creative repurposing is something that I do often with our clients, where we'll actually find creative ways to repurpose things that they cherish a lot. There are ways where you can turn t-shirts into teddy bears or quilts. And there are ways that you can turn blankets, into pillowcases, just smaller versions of those. So it's kind of fun to see what different, methods are out there to creatively repurpose things. And I've also in the past, if you want to maybe repurpose a piece of furniture that means a lot to you, a lot of times there are hutches, buffets in dining rooms. And I see a lot that people are very tied to those pieces of furniture, but they take up a large amount of wall space. So if you can repurpose a piece of furniture so you could bring it with you, I've had it in the past where we'll actually take the top of the hutch off, and then we'll repurpose the hutch as an entryway table. So you're still maintaining that storage space, and you're bringing the piece of furniture that's very, sentimental to you, but in a way that you may not have thought about before. So that's something to think about. And it's also a really great opportunity to consider digitizing your photos and your files, which I know does not sound fun, but it can be very positive to do this. So let me talk a little bit here on this. We live in a world now where there are so many different tools available for us, to the point where it's overwhelming how many tools there are that we can use. So I do though recommend digitizing photos whenever you're able to, for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, I advocate for it because you save a lot of physical space. Same thing with files, but photos especially, so often you've got family photos that have been sitting in boxes for a really long time, and your family likely has not seen a lot of those pictures. So I'll use the example. My mom actually, she digitized all of our family photos, and I had not seen probably 98% of those pictures before. And now I've got an app on my phone that I can go onto at any point. I can look through the photos, they're organized on that app, so I can find them and I can share them too, which I think is really neat. So it's an opportunity to actually share those pictures that have been sitting in a closet or whatever it might be for a long time. And there's that thought too with document digitizing, where it's easier to share documents, especially important documents, with loved ones if you need to. So something to think about. And another approach that we've had with photos, because photos for a lot of people are, you can't just throw photos away. You know, they mean a lot to you. They're very sentimental. I mean, that's your life and those are your memories. So we'll creatively approach photos a lot of times. And I've had it where we'll actually pull the physical photo from the frame that it's in, especially if the frame's, you know, a little bit bigger and it's taking up table space or surface area that you're not going to have in your new home. And when you pull that photo, then you have the opportunity to put it into a photo album. And I've even had it where clients will want us to take a picture of a photo on the wall. So maybe they have limited wall space for artwork and they don't have the space for a really meaningful framed photo piece of art that they have. So we'll take a photo of that and actually put it into a photo album. So there are different approaches that you can have there. And then I also want to touch on emotional detachment through sharing. That's a piece that I wanted to talk about, kind of tying into sharing the memories that you have associated with certain things in your home. Use this as an opportunity to share those stories with your family while you're sorting through. And sometimes that will actually provide some closure, so you're able to get rid of the item. Maybe you've never shared that story before and your family didn't know, and you didn't realize that you never shared that with your family or your friends. And then maybe you're actually able to let go of the physical item after that. And there are also some really, really neat tools available. There's one called Storyworth, actually, and that's just an example of the many tools available that you're able to share your story on that platform. You can take photos of the items in your home, and it helps preserve the stories. So many people in your family or your friends can actually have access to that story and those memories, so they understand truly how meaningful something was to you. So those are some creative methods as you're working through the downsizing process to consider. And then now I'm going to talk about utilizing your new space effectively. This is especially important, obviously, if you're moving into a space that is much smaller. I wanted to just include a couple of pieces of advice that are key in what we do to set clients up for success. So I very, very often see, obviously, you know, from looking at a space, you're going to have to eliminate furniture. That's typically something that people are prepared for. But something that's often overlooked is storage space. And usually when you're downsizing, your new storage spaces are much more limited. They're smaller. I see all the time where kitchen cabinets are significantly shorter than previous cabinets. So you're losing a lot of that shelf space. And I always recommend that you actually plan out how to use the storage space in your new home before the move to help drive decisions as you're downsizing. I just see so often that storage spaces are overlooked and they're missed. And as you get closer to the move, you just decide, let's just take it and I'll figure it out. And I feel like that really does add to the stress of the situation. So I also recommend prioritizing items that might offer dual purpose storage solutions. So if there's a cabinet that you're considering that has a lot of storage space in it versus maybe something that doesn't have that same storage space, I always advocate to bring the piece with storage in it because it's just something that's always missed. And I don't think there's any such thing as too much storage. So tying into that point, and another major key to success is floor planning. So I like to bring this up. Floor planning, space planning is sometimes also what we call it. And I like to tell people that you should allow the space to dictate what you bring and then work backwards from there. Because when you're looking at everything that you have in your home, it can be incredibly overwhelming to think in your head through what would actually fit in the new space. So start with the floor plan. Take measurements of furniture if you're able to verify that they'll actually fit in the new space. And keep in mind size and their function too. So a lot of times furniture takes up a much larger footprint than what we expect it to. So that's where measuring is very helpful. And again, with the dual purpose pieces of furniture, if you're able to bring those in. And I also strongly advise to create a floor plan because if you wait until you move into the new space, this is especially applicable on move day, it is complete chaos to try and figure out in the moment of the move where furniture is going to be placed. So I think that would overwhelm anybody, especially if if you're moving into a smaller space. So don't put it on yourself to make those decisions on move day or after the move, because it's just more logistics that you have to deal with. So I advocate for floor planning for a lot of different reasons, but those are kind of the key points that I wanted to share. Okay, and then obviously, huge piece of downsizing is the emotional aspects of it. And I wanted to include a section that specifically talked about these and some emotional considerations that you should have as you're working through this. So I'm sure a lot of you are struggling with the thought of downsizing because you very likely have items that are highly sentimental to you. And this is a very personal process, and I don't want to downplay how difficult this is. I want you to know it's very difficult to go through this process, especially when you're a sentimental person and you've got emotional attachments to things. But I think a couple of keys here to talk about. It's important to recognize and respect the attachment that you have to the items that you're sentimental, with, and recognize the emotions that come up throughout the process of downsizing. Try and figure out why you're having such a hard time with letting certain things go, because I think that's often overlooked. You just think in your mind, I'm having a really hard time with that piece. And you don't really dig into the reason why. So that might help you in your decision-making process a little bit. And I also just want to say, I mean, obviously, it's perfectly okay to feel emotional about those things, but try and find a balance between allowing your emotions to decide what you bring and also making sure that this space will work for you, on the other side. So it's all a balance, and have grace with yourself. I think that's important to say too, because again, it is a highly emotional process, and what you're feeling is completely valid and it's overwhelming. So then we've got another emotional aspect that might come up is family dynamics. And I see this all the time. And this is also a very normal part of the process, and it can be a little bit difficult to navigate. So I wanted to just give a little bit of advice here on how to approach this so you're prepared. I think if there's, disagreements, approach these disagreements with empathy and have patience. Usually disagreements stem from everyone not being on the same page, or maybe not knowing where you're coming from emotionally. And I think I most often see that in the context of adult children having a lot of frustration toward their parents because their parents won't let things go. And I think so often that stems from, both sides to an extent, the parents not really driving in what is going on emotionally with them and explaining to their children why this is such a difficult process. So maybe, the child doesn't have as much empathy as they could if they had the whole picture. So I think just being very patient throughout the process, no matter what side you stand on, that is absolute key, because again, this whole presentation is geared toward, validating how difficult this is. And I also think especially if there's a situation where there's many different family members involved, maybe you're trying to figure out who gets what and you're trying to figure out, dispersing items. I think whenever you're able to have inclusive decision making, try and involve key family members whenever appropriate, just to make sure everyone feels heard. And on the flip side, if you feel like your children are making decisions for you, try and talk through that process and figure that out together. So I think it's just very important. Patience is key here, and understanding on both ends. It's very hard to go through. So I just wanted to mention that because I see that very often in what I do. And then obviously we've got a huge emotional component with feeling like you're letting your memories go, right? So I'm sure a lot of people relate to this here. And there are some very creative ways that you can preserve those memories that you may feel like you're letting go of. Like I said earlier, there are a lot of different tools available that can help. So something that may be considered in this is creating some form of legacy project. So maybe this is in the form of a memory book or even just a digital slideshow, something that can actually preserve the stories behind your belongings. So that carries on in future generations. You can share that with your children and your grandchildren. And then, like we talked about earlier, utilizing the digital tools that are available to share family histories, stories. So again, it kind of, there's a delicate balance, but I do think it's so important to share why things are meaningful to you, because it's easy to say, I'm a highly sentimental person. And a lot of times people don't really understand the full scope of why that is. So it's a good opportunity. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about, this is our final section. I'm going to talk about some tools and resources that are available that you could actually use throughout this process to help you. And I'll also touch a little bit on the different types of professional help that's available that might help you as well. So, first thing that I wanted to start with, which I've touched on this a couple times throughout, but going back to it, planning is absolute key. And I think it's important to provide you with some actual tools on how to figure out how to start the planning process. So make checklists and create timelines so you've got a system throughout the downsizing process. And when I say make a checklist, I mean actually to some capacity, either write it out or create it digitally. And with that checklist, try and also include an action plan with action steps on your side to keep you accountable. This kind of ties into bringing a friend or a family member on to hold you accountable throughout the process. Maybe schedule check-ins in that action plan, however that looks for you, but make sure that it's tailored to you so it works and it's a system that you will actually stick to. Another piece of this that I always recommend doing whenever possible, if you are able to, try and create an inventory. And this can look very different depending on the situations. It looks different for everyone, but I like to actually take photos of each room of the house, and then I create a corresponding list of every item in that room. And your goal should be to try and make a decision for every item, especially furniture, in the house. And that inventory would allow you to see room by room, oh, I didn't make decisions on this piece of furniture or whatever it might be. I should come back to that and figure that out. And on the inventory, you're able to make notes. Maybe you want to come back to something because it falls in the maybe category. So you could keep track of that. And that's another way to hold yourself accountable. So you would come back to the decision at a later date. It's also very helpful to have an inventory if there's a lot of different pieces to the move. So if you're dispersing items, or maybe you're moving out of the house and there's a number of items that are going to be staying for donation, or maybe you're selling some items, it's just an easy way to keep everything well organized. And then I know this is always a very common question, so I wanted to make a slide specific to better understanding item worth and knowing what tools there are available to you to try and figure out the actual worth of an item. And we'll talk through a little bit on how to sell those items as well. So obviously, knowing what something is worth can really help drive your decision on what to do with it. So maybe you're thinking about selling something rather than donating it. It's important for you to know the actual value of the item. And so, unfortunately, with what I see, things are worth a lot less in resale than they were originally purchased for, which is unfortunate. And I know that that's frustrating, but that's not always the case. And there are also a lot of different tools that you can use to try and figure out the true value of something. The first one of those tools that you could lean on is, getting an appraisal of something. So if you have jewelry or artwork that you're curious on the value of, maybe consider getting an appraisal so you know that that is actual true market value of that item. If you don't want to go that route, there are also tools online that you can use. So I personally recommend to try and find the actual value of something. Go on to either eBay or live auctioneers, and you can actually filter out by price sold. So search the item, filter on whatever platform you find it on. Don't work off of the list priced of the item, because so often things are listed for a lot higher than they're actually worth. And if you look at those really high listed items, a lot of times they've been on the market for a really long time. So that's just a trick to try and figure out, what is this item actually selling for? Is there a market for it? And there's also a really neat tool that you can rely on, and I use it all the time. Google, I'm sure many of you know, but some of you might not. Google actually has an image search function. So if you take a picture of something, you can actually drag and drop that picture into Google, and it will pull items that are similar or the same. And a lot of times those items, it'll be, say it's a painting or it's a piece of art. You drop the picture of that into Google image search, and it will pull the exact same thing from the search. Most of the time it will. And then you can actually, click around and you can find the value of it. So I find that to be incredibly helpful. And that is something I rely on often in what I do. Okay. So I know, again, a lot of information in a short amount of time. So I also wanted to just touch on the different types of professional support that are available if you're feeling overwhelmed. And I tried to break this down and consolidate it, because obviously there's a lot more professional support available than what I've included on this slide. But these are the types of professionals that so often come into the downsizing piece of the process. So you've got support from senior and specialty move managers if you're feeling like you need it. And it varies depending on the company, but they can provide support for planning and packing and setting up your new space and actually sorting through things with you and keeping that on track and organized. And then you've got estate liquidators, which come in for the selling piece of the process. So this is kind of a general term, but generally estate liquidators specialize in sometimes appraising and selling personal property through estate sales or auctions, or maybe even direct sales. Oftentimes they require a larger quantity of items. So if you don't have that much to sell, maybe consigning your furniture items or your other items, that could be a better fit. But that comes into play in the process. And then you've also got appraisers, and there are also collectibles advisors that are available if you need some guidance on specific collections. So these professionals would offer valuations for specific items like art, jewelry, collections. They can actually tell you the true value of those collections that you have. And I think this is especially if you have a high value collection, I think this is huge. And they're also helpful if you need to get something insured. They can point you in the right direction on how to sell certain things. So, and then it also helps if you're thinking about donating things and you don't know what the valuation to tie it to for tax purposes, it could be helpful for that as well. And then I just wanted to touch a little bit on how to choose a senior move manager. And like I said, my goal for this today is I'm not here to sell you. I just want you to have information. So if this is something that you are considering, you know exactly what to look for. So I used the guidelines that I hold Transitions Made Simple to create this slide. So these are the things I would recommend looking for if you're considering this. They should be trained on how to properly communicate with and advocate for older adults. Most senior move managers are affiliated with the National Association for Senior and Specialty Move Management. So I would highly recommend working with someone with that group because we all follow a specific code of ethics. And we are strong advocates for our client. We usually work as a neutral third party, which helps mitigate any family conflict, anything like that. We've got a very vast network of professionals and resources in place, and we're highly compassionate and empathetic. We've seen this situation a lot, so we can be really empathetic as you're working toward this process. Okay, like I said, I covered so much information today, and I will absolutely consolidate all of that into a summary for you because it was a lot of words on slides, and I'm sure you probably missed some certain points, which is okay. But the key takeaways that I want you to walk away with today, we talked about this earlier, the importance of early action and just being patient with yourself and having grace with the emotions that you're feeling throughout this process. So just think about how these strategies that are included in today's talk, how they apply to your life, and maybe consider starting small and have grace with yourself. Even if you're making small steps, you're still making progress, which is a positive. So, and just know you're not alone. There are so many people that have gone through this, or they're going through this, or they're supporting someone through the process of downsizing. And there's a lot of help available if you need it. So I think we can move into the Q&A, which I'm sure there are probably a lot of questions. And I am more than happy to answer anything that might come up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christina. That was just a lot of really helpful and useful information. I'm sure folks do have questions, and there was one in the chat that I want to get to first, which was I think it says, how do you charge your fees? Or I guess, how do you determine what the fees are when you're working with folks? You're okay answering that.
That's a really fair question. So we actually do project pricing. So because it is just so different for every person, right? So we will come in, we'll do a free consultation, and we'll come in, and I am very transparent with our pricing. So we'll have a range available that the project would fall within. That's a good question though.
That makes sense, right? Because like each 4,000 square foot home is different than a 1,400 square foot home.
Yeah, there are so many different considerations, and not every client needs all of the services that we offer too. So we cater that specifically to each client. Good question.
Does anyone else have any questions that they want to either unmute or put into the chat and ask?
Yeah, I'll ask something if that's okay.
Of course.
That there's a critical point that you made about trying to evaluate any given item once.
Yes.
I mean, you can see that if you don't do that, it can become chaotic in 15 minutes.
Exactly.
Is a good criterion the sense of joy thing. I find that if I have a couple of things and look at them in that sense, it becomes much more efficient. And I'm just wondering, that's only one criterion, or it's a critical emotion, it's a generic emotion. I was just wondering if that kind of evaluation can help advance the objective of looking at something once.
Of course. So really focusing on the things that bring you a lot of joy, and this is especially applicable, right, to downsizing. So you don't want to go through the process of moving things if they don't make you happy, right? So your new space, I feel like it's such a fun opportunity to feel refreshed, and it can be so fun and so exciting. if you allow it to be. So I like that point of the things that spark joy, allowing that to kind of dictate what you do, the decisions that you make. And I think that is absolutely an important emotion to really focus on, you know? I love that. It's a positive take though, right? I like that a lot.
Thanks.
Is that a reference to the Marie Kondo, like,
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly right.
kind of movement that has come about in the last however many years?
Yeah. She
Well, and
puts it in book form, but all you need is a single page, just says joy, and you know what she means.
no, that's so true. And your space should feel peaceful to you. And I think I'm such an advocate for making decisions before the move. That way, once you're finished with downsizing, you can just put that chapter behind you and you can focus on the positive aspects of the change rather than, oh, I need to revisit those things that I didn't decide on. So I am a huge advocate for no storage units because that's just going to cause you anxiety, you know?
Thanks.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you for asking that.
Any other questions that came up for folks? I guess one thing that came up for me, right, if somebody has not started this process, I know you said, of course, the earlier you start, the better. But let's say someone does have like a cognitive issue, or, you know, sort of how might you approach or help someone who didn't start early and might need extra support?
We see this scenario probably most often, honestly, where it's sort of a rushed transition for them because maybe it's a health issue or whatever the situation might be. And our goal when we come in that situation is to make sure that emotionally and mentally they are doing okay. And we do everything we can to fully support them. So I am massive on making sure that they feel in control, even if they're out of control because a health crisis or something is, you know, the start of all this. So I see that all the time. And I think oftentimes the sooner that we can make the move happen, the better within reason. So we, just to give you an idea, in situations like that, we've made it happen, you know, within 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the situation. And we very closely monitor their well-being to make sure they're okay with that. A lot of different factors go into it though. And yeah, it's difficult, but
I've helped my mom with
Question.
Alzheimer's. And one of the things I realized is we planned beautifully in the first 2 stages, but getting her to insist it, I wasn't quite sure what to take. But I looked at what she had placed in front of her in the 3 different homes she had been in terms of paintings. So we had the same painting that she could see even from her bedroom and assisted. And we wanted one other piece of furniture. I walked around the living room and she started petting this one cupboard. And I went, that's it. So that observational thing is a great way to still identify feelings.
absolutely. And I love that you took those paintings that I'm assuming she faced in the space.
Yeah, there was one in her bedroom and one in her living room when she arranged it, or early in the move. So we kept those in her line of sight throughout the process.
And that gave her, I'm sure, a sense of control. And
it was her room. There was also a wreath that she had on her door in all 4 places in the process. So she knew that was her door. So it was a Christmas wreath, but it was there all year long because
it was familiar to her.
So just those of us who've had a lot of experience in this, 2 generations of Alzheimer's in my family. So
sorry. Oh my gosh.
That brings up a very related question in my mind. It was great that you had the space identified to where things were going. My question is, if you don't yet know where you're going, you know you're going somewhere different, but you don't have that space, that's a lot of information that's absent in terms of right away furniture.
Yep.
do you still get started in some way, even though you don't have that space specifically identified?
I think so. I absolutely advocate. And it can, obviously that sounds daunting, right? To start, even though you don't know where you're going to be going. And the floor plan is a huge driver, especially for the furniture. So I think this is a really good question. And I think just starting on those spaces, so often I see like an attic that has not been touched in forever. Or your garage, it just naturally accumulates a lot of stuff. So if you can start in those spaces, that will help you a lot later on, because those spaces really, there's a lot of decisions to be made in storage spaces especially. But also going back to your point of joy, I think if there's something that you just know you don't want to hang on to, get rid of it, I don't think, especially if it's something that you're thinking about in the near future, that those are ways that you can start on the process and just get rid of things incrementally, and that will help you a lot. So if there's a furniture piece you just do not like in your house, get rid of it.
Well, it would seem that the attic and the garage are two great places where there's a minimal amount of joy, because that's what the stuff's been sitting up there for years.
Yes, yes. And they'll sneak up on you too, because a lot of times those are kind of afterthought areas, because you're really focusing on the furniture pieces. And I so often see close to the move, there's almost a panic to get through those spaces. And that to me is low hanging fruit, especially if you haven't been in those areas in a long time. Chances are you're not going to want to take a good majority of things in those spaces. Great question.
That's really, really good advice. I think for anybody that has stuff accumulating over however many years. I see that Violet, your hand has been up for a while, so I want to give you a chance to ask your question. Let me see. I'll ask you to unmute.
There.
Okay, perfect.
Hi. So we kind of have a double whammy, but one of the things that that I think is a problem is we've got, between stepkids and grandchildren, there are like 20 people involved, all of whom might want something. And I have always told them, think about what you would like to have, if anything, from this house, and we can earmark it for you or something like that. But we have a really special problem in the sense that my husband and I got married and we never really thinned out our stuff. So we have his old house and my old house with pretty much everything that was there here. So I think it's going to be interesting to figure this out.
And you know what, though, every situation comes with some complication, and I think just there's always a challenge. And it sounds like logistically that might be a lot, especially with coordinating, the different pieces. So I would recommend, in addition to physically marking things, I highly recommend making an inventory if you're able to. And it does not have to be formal, but I think that will keep you sane through the process, because you'll be able to go back to a document that lists out explicitly who is going to get what. And it also really, really helps if there are multiple people interested in the same thing. You can resort back to that, inventory, and make a note that you've got something to figure out with the multiple people involved. And I find sometimes we'll actually do a digital inventory, and we'll share it with the different parties involved. So we'll use like a Google document, and people can actually go in and mark what they're interested in. So that's another consideration that you could think about.
Right. Right.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you're so, yeah, have you been in my house? Because it sounds like you have. I mean, we have a storage area where there are boxes that have not been touched in 30 years.
I see that all the time.
Thank you.
Of course.
There's another question, similar to the question about photos that you talked about, in terms of paper and files. Keep, discard, digitize, question mark.
No, that every single person, I mean, I'm sitting in my home office and I have a lot of physical papers in here too. I think every single person is guilty of having a lot of paperwork and files that you think you'll need and you actually will not need. So my recommendation, I mean, I'll work with clients often that have tax documents from 2002. And I tell them, I think that's a very fair example of something that can be shredded. You know, we could destroy that. You're not going to need that again. That's not something that you have to waste your energy on digitizing. But I think it's a good opportunity as you're thinking about this. A lot of times family members need access to important documents. And so it might be worth considering digitizing those really important files and giving them secure access to those. That way they've got it, they know how to access those things, and it's not a physical file that they would have to search for. So it's just a good opportunity to think about that. And tax records, I always recommend keeping. I think the general rule of thumb is 7 years, but you can do 5 if you want. So anything before that, any financials, you are fine to shred, unless it's something that you definitely want to hold on to. So then I would consider, if you're able to digitize it, think about doing that. It's less clutter. Did that answer your question, Cheryl?
I'm seeing her head nod.
Awesome.
I have a question. Where do you go or how do you find how to digitize things?
There are so many different resources out there. That's an awesome question. And we actually have partners that we work with through NASM that will provide our clients with discounted rates on those services. So we like to work with those, and we've got a number of different companies. Everybody's got different pricing and all of that. So we just provide resources for that. And that might be something that's worth adding to the summary that I'm going to make a note to do that. I think that would be helpful to a lot of different people. So I'm happy to provide recommendations for that. Very good question.
Thanks for doing that. That sounds like it would be helpful for folks.
Yeah,
I
I think
know, you know, where to get started with those kinds of things. Where to turn.
All right. I wrote that down, so I'll add that. Thank you for asking that.
Any other questions? I know, as I mentioned before, we will be sharing the video of today's presentation and the summary handout, and we will send out a link for an evaluation as well. And there will be further resources and links all on our website. So we'll make sure you all get all the information from the whole conference, including today's presentation. And if there are no other last minute thoughts or questions, it seems like a lot of folks have said that that's very helpful, and I can see personally as well that this is very helpful and useful information. And just thank you for the work that you do to help folks downsize and go through this really difficult process. So, and thank you for sharing all this information with us today.
Absolutely. That was really fun. I'm so happy that everyone joined today, and I appreciate your time, and I had a lot of fun. It's so much information. So I will, like I said, I'll share summaries so everybody has that moving forward.
Just in time for spring cleaning,
I
everyone.
know, right? I know. Aw. Well, thank you. That was a lot of fun. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and we hope to see you all at our Aging and Thriving conference next year. And like I said, we'll send out all that information in the evaluation next week.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You got it, Shoshana.
Yeah, I'm moving.
That was great.
That was yeah, that was awesome. I think she's so sweet and she did a good job, I think, sharing really practical information.
Actually, whoops. Let me, John, you have to edit this part out. I forgot to stop recording.